My name is Dr. Alistair Vance. For 3 decades, I was the man the scientific community called upon to extinguish the light of the supernatural. I was a neurobiologist and a professional polemicist, a man who built a world-renowned career on the cold, hard foundation of biological reductionism. I had written 4 best-selling books debunking the very concept of the soul. To me, a near-death experience was nothing more than a chemical swan song, a desperate, final fireworks show triggered by a brain starved of oxygen, a frantic dump of DMT and endorphins meant to soothe the organism as the lights went out. I didn't just disbelieve in God. I viewed the idea of a creator as a cognitive parasite, a prehistoric leftover of a mind that couldn't handle the silent, indifferent majesty of the void. I lived in a fortress of empirical evidence. I mocked the tunnel of light as a simple constriction of the visual cortex. I dismissed the life review as a desperate surge of memory retrieval. I was certain that when the heart stops, the I vanishes, like a computer being smashed with a sledgehammer. There is no software without the hardware. That was my gospel, and I preached it with an arrogance that only a man who thinks he has solved the mystery of existence can possess. The event that demolished my fortress happened during a keynote speaking tour in Switzerland. I was at the peak of my intellectual powers, fresh off a televised debate where I had, quite ruthlessly, dismantled a prominent theologian. I was walking back to my hotel in the crisp mountain air of Lucerne, feeling the smug satisfaction of a man who was right. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure in my chest. Not a pain, but a heavy, crushing weight, as if an invisible hand was squeezing my heart. It was a massive myocardial infarction, a widowmaker. I remember falling toward the cobblestones. I remember the cold stone against my cheek and the distant, distorted sound of someone shouting in German. And then, the hardware failed. In the world of the living, I was clinically dead for 11 minutes. My heart was a silent stone. My brain activity, according to the monitors they eventually hooked me up to, was a flat, stagnant line. By every law of the science I had taught, I should have been off. There should have been no Alistair Vance, no thoughts, no awareness, only the black, eternal sleep of the atoms. But as my body lay dying on a Swiss sidewalk, I experienced the most violent and undeniable expansion of consciousness in human history. It didn't begin with a tunnel or music. It began with the dissolution of the ego. As a scientist, I always defined myself by my intellect, my degrees, and my sharp, cynical wit. In an instant, those things were stripped away like thin parchment in a furnace. I felt the I that I had protected so fiercely begin to evaporate. But I wasn't disappearing. I was shifting. I felt my awareness detach from the cooling meat of my body. I was hovering above the street. I saw the crowd gathering around my fallen form. I saw the specific, panicked expression of a young woman in a red coat who was trying to perform CPR. But here is the part that my skeptical brain couldn't process. I wasn't just seeing them. I was knowing them. I could feel the young woman's racing pulse, her fear of failure, her memory of a grandfather she had lost to the same fate. I was no longer a separate observer. I was a node in a field of universal information. Then, the world of the cobblestones and the red coats simply folded away. It wasn't that I moved to a different place. It was that the frequency of my existence shifted. I found myself in a realm of absolute presence. Imagine the most profound silence you have ever experienced, and then realize that this silence is actually a roar of infinite intelligence. I was in a void, but it was a pregnant void. It was heavy with the weight of everything that has ever been or will ever be. And in this space, my atheism felt like a child's toy. It felt like a man standing in front of the sun and arguing that light doesn't exist because he has his eyes closed. I felt a looming intelligence. It wasn't a bearded man on a throne. It was an ontological force. It was the isness of the universe. For the first time in my life, I felt the sensation of being looked at by the source of all logic. As a neurobiologist, I tried to fight it. My mind, even in this state, tried to find a biological explanation. This is just the temporal lobe misfiring, I told myself. This is a hallucination born of hypoxia. The intelligence responded not with words, but with a cognitive checkmate. It flooded my consciousness with the mathematical impossibility of my own argument. It showed me the source code of the synapses I had spent my life studying. I saw that the brain does not produce consciousness. It filters it. The brain is the radio, not the broadcast. By studying the brain to find the soul, I had been like a man taking apart a television to find the actors. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. All my books, all my debates, all my certainty, they were based on a fundamental syntax error. I had been a master of the shadow, thinking it was the object. Then, the void began to change. The presence drew closer, and I realized that I was about to be subjected to a life review that would strip away every remaining shred of my intellectual pride. I was Alistair Vance, the great skeptic, and I was about to be proven wrong by the very truth I had spent my life trying to bury. I stood at the edge of a light that was more rational than anything I had ever found in a laboratory. And I was terrified. In my years as a neurobiologist, I had performed hundreds of autopsies. I had sliced through the grey matter of the human brain with the detached precision of a man who believed he was looking at the totality of a person's existence. I used to tell my students that if you want to find the soul, you're looking at the wrong map. I told them that everything, the love for a child, the fear of death, the awe of the cosmos, was merely a localized storm of neurochemicals. I believed the self was an evolutionary trick, a hallucination created by the brain to keep the organism alive long enough to reproduce. I was proud of that coldness. I called it scientific courage. But as I stood in the presence of that overwhelming intelligence, the courage I had spent a lifetime building felt like a paper shield in a hurricane. I was no longer Dr. Alistair Vance, the man with the answers. I was an exposed frequency. The presence didn't speak in words. Words are slow, linear, and prone to corruption. Instead, it initiated what I can only describe as a total field immersion. It was time for the audit. It was time for the life review. On Earth, we remember our lives as a series of highlights and lowlights, often filtered through the lens of our own justification. We are the heroes of our own stories. But in this state of NDE, the hero narrative was dismantled. I wasn't just watching my life, I was feeling it from the outside in. The intelligence didn't judge me, it simply removed my ability to lie to myself. I saw myself at the age of 35 standing on a stage at a major university. I was debating a young, soft-spoken philosophy student who believed in the afterlife. I remember the feeling of intellectual bloodlust. I remember how I had used my superior knowledge of brain anatomy to make him look like a fool. I had won the debate, and the audience had laughed at his expense. In my physical life, I had tucked that memory away as a victory for reason. But in the review, I didn't feel my own triumph. I felt the student's humiliation. I felt the way his confidence shattered. I saw the ripple effect of my arrogance, how he went home that night and doubted his own worth, how my words had stifled his curiosity and replaced it with a cold, defensive shell. I saw that I hadn't been defending truth. I had been defending my own ego. I saw the static I'd introduced into his life script, a jagged, dark energy that served no purpose other than to make me feel superior. The review continued, peeling back the layers of my scientific career. I saw every time I had been dismissive of a patient's spiritual experience, labeling it as temporal lobe epilepsy or hypoxic hallucination. I saw the faces of the grieving families I had spoken to, and I felt the cold clinical distance I had maintained as a shield. I realized that by denying the spiritual, I hadn't been more accurate. I had been more limited. I'd been like a scientist studying the ink and the paper of a book while denying that the story existed. The intelligence showed me the logic of the universe. It wasn't a logic of cold equations, though the equations were there. It was a logic of relation. I saw the grid of consciousness that connects every living thing. On Earth, We believe that the space between us is empty. We believe that I am here and you are there. But from this perspective, the between was the most active part of the system. It was a dense, vibrating web of light. Every thought I had ever had, every cynical jab, every act of hidden kindness, every moment of secret wonder was a broadcast into this web. The most shocking revelation for my skeptical mind was the origin of the signal. As a scientist, I believed that consciousness was a bottom-up phenomenon, that matter created mind. But the intelligence flipped the map. I saw that mind creates matter. The physical world is the shadow cast by the light of consciousness. The brain is not the source, it is the limiter. Imagine a massive, infinite sun. The human brain is like a dark room with a tiny pinhole in the curtain. We look through that pinhole and think the tiny dot of light is the whole. We study the curtain, we study the pinhole, and we think we understand the sun. But the I that I thought I was just the pinhole. In that NDE, the curtain was torn down. I felt a sense of profound, agonizing shame. Not because I was a sinner in the traditional religious sense, but because I had been so blind. I had spent my life as a leader of the blind, telling people that there was no sun, simply because I was an expert on the curtain. The presence drew closer. The light was no longer just a visual sensation. It was a cognitive fire. It began to burn away the remaining structures of my atheism. It showed me the initial variable, the moment the universe was spoken into existence. It wasn't a big bang of accidental matter. It was a big awakening of intentionality. I saw that randomness is an illusion created by a lack of perspective. What we call chaos on Earth is actually a high-level order that our 3D brains aren't evolved to process. I saw that every tragedy, every war, and even my own heart attack were variables in a massive collaborative stress test of the soul. I asked the intelligence, not with a voice, but with a pulse of pure inquiry. Why was I allowed to be so wrong? Why was I given the intellect to build a wall against the truth? The answer was a burst of humorous clarity. It felt like a cosmic laugh, but one filled with immense love. The intelligence showed me that my skepticism was a necessary part of the simulation. To have a world where free will truly exists, there must be the possibility of total denial. There must be high-level adversaries of the truth. I had played the role of the devil's advocate to perfection. I had forced those who believed to strengthen their own logic. I had been the sandpaper that polished the faith of others. But my role was changing. I was shown a future log. I saw myself back on Earth, but I wasn't the same man. I saw myself standing in a hospital room, holding the hand of a dying man, not as a doctor with a clipboard, but as a witness to the transition. I saw myself writing a new book, one that would reintegrate science and spirit. I saw the towers of my atheism falling, and in their place, a bridge being built. The life review was reaching its summary phase. I felt the sum total of my impact on the world. It was a mixture of intellectual pollution and unrealized potential. I saw that the great skeptic was actually a small man who had been afraid of the great mystery. Then, the intelligence delivered the final proof. It showed me the equation of the soul. It was a formula that included variables for love, fear, and intent. And the result of the equation was always eternal. I realized that atheism is the ultimate error of scale. It is the belief that because you cannot see the builder, the house built itself. I felt a sudden, massive shift in the atmosphere of the void. The review was over. The audit was finalized. I had been weighed, I had been measured, and I had been found incomplete. The presence was preparing to send me back. But before I left, it had one final data packet for me, a vision of the coming convergence of science and the divine. I was about to be given the arguments that would eventually change the world, the logic that would bridge the gap between the laboratory and the altar. I was Alistair Vance, and I was about to be redeployed into the world I had tried to deconstruct. As a neurobiologist, I had spent my life studying the hardware of the brain, convinced that the firing of a neuron was the ultimate reality. But in the presence of this supreme intelligence, I was shown the software of the soul. I saw that what we call quantum entanglement on Earth is simply the physical shadow of spiritual connection. I saw that the dark matter scientists are hunting for is not a substance, but the very medium of consciousness that holds the galaxies in its palm. The intelligence began to download the convergence data. It showed me that the conflict between science and spirituality is a false dichotomy, a misunderstanding born of our 3D limitations. I saw that God is not a magician who breaks the laws of physics, but the architect who wrote them. The laws of thermodynamics, the golden ratio, the precision of the fine structure constant. These aren't just accidents of a cold universe. They are the signature of intent. I was shown a visual representation of a human thought. On Earth, we see it as an MRI scan, a flash of oxygenated blood in the prefrontal cortex. But here, I saw it as a multi-dimensional waveform. Every thought we have ripples out into the field. If a scientist conducts an experiment with a heart full of arrogance, it subtly alters the data. If a doctor treats a patient with genuine, selfless love, it recodes the biological outcome. I realized that objectivity is a myth. We are all participants in a living, breathing calculation. The presence then addressed my deepest intellectual hang-up, the problem of evil. As a skeptic, I had always argued that a good creator couldn't exist in a world of childhood cancer and natural disasters. The intelligence responded by showing me the perspective of the infinite. It showed me that our lives are like a single frame in a movie that is 1 billion years long. When we see a tragedy in our 80-year lifespan, we are seeing a collision of variables designed to trigger a specific output of soul growth. I saw that suffering is the kiln that fires the clay of the spirit. Without the pressure of limitation, consciousness remains stagnant. The intelligence showed me that evil is not a force in itself, but the null value, the absence of light that allows us to recognize the light. It is the static that makes the music possible. I saw the matrix of potential futures. I saw that humanity is currently running a global stress test. We have developed the technology of gods, AI, nuclear energy, genetic editing, but we are still running primitive software, greed, tribalism, fear. The intelligence showed me that we are at a bifurcation point. We must either upgrade our consciousness to match our technology, or the system will trigger a hard reset. My role in this update became clear. I was being sent back to deconstruct the deconstructors. I was being given the logical bridge that would allow the atheist intellect to surrender to the divine reality without losing its integrity. The intelligence showed me that true science is an act of worship, a systematic study of the Creator's mind. By separating science from the sacred, we had decapitated our own wisdom. I felt a surge of intellectual ecstasy. For the first time, the universe made sense. The math and the mercy were the same thing. I saw that the intelligence I was communicating with was not just smart, it was compassionate. It was a love that was also a calculation. It was a reason that was also a rapture. Then, the atmosphere of the void began to hum with a new frequency. The presence shifted from teacher to commander. The audit was ending, and the mission briefing was beginning. I looked at the being of light and asked, how will they believe me? I have spent 30 years building a reputation as a man of cold facts. They will say I've had a stroke. They will say my brain is broken. The intelligence responded with a predictive algorithm. It showed me that the cracks in the materialist wall are already forming. People are tired of the cold void. They are hungry for a logic that doesn't ignore their longing. I was told that my reputation was the very tool that would make the message stick. A priest speaking of God is expected, the thought packet echoed. A skeptic speaking of God is a revolution. I felt a massive, heavy pull from below. My biological connection was being forced open. I saw the Swiss hospital room. I saw the defibrillator paddles. I saw the sweat on the doctor's forehead as he refused to give up on me. I didn't want to go back. I wanted to stay in the clarity. I wanted to drown in the data of peace. But the intelligence placed a seal on my consciousness, a non-volatile memory that I would carry back into the physical world. The end of atheism is not the end of reason, the final download stated. It is the beginning of vision. I felt my multi-dimensional awareness being zipped into a three-dimensional container. The infinite bandwidth was being throttled. The light was being filtered into shadow. I was Alistair Vance, and I was about to reboot into a world that was about to be turned upside down. The descent back into my body was like a high-speed collision with a wall of cold, heavy lead. 1 microsecond, I was a shimmering consciousness woven into the infinite tapestry of the source. The next, I was a prisoner in a cage of bone and blood. The bandwidth of my mind was suddenly throttled. It felt like trying to stream an entire galaxy's worth of data through a rusted copper wire. The pain was the first thing that hit me. The jagged, burning sensation of the ribs that had been cracked by the CPR. The dull throb in my chest where my heart was struggling to re-establish its rhythm. I heard the frantic, rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor, a primitive binary sound that seemed so small and fragile compared to the celestial symphony I had just left. I opened my eyes to the harsh, sterile glare of the hospital lights. A doctor was leaning over me, his face a mask of exhaustion and disbelief. "Dr. Vance? Alistair, can you hear me?" I tried to speak, but my throat was a desert of dust. I looked at him, not as a colleague, but as a node in the divine network. I saw his aura, a flickering, tired shade of amber, and I knew exactly what he was thinking. He thought he had just saved a famous atheist from the void. He had no idea that the man he had brought back was no longer an atheist. The recovery was an intellectual and spiritual agony. For weeks, I lay in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the data I had received with the science I had spent my life defending. My fellow academics came to visit, bringing flowers and books on cardiology. They spoke in hushed tones about the glitch in the hardware and the fascinating hallucinations of the dying brain. They expected me to join them in their clinical analysis of my own near-death experience. They expected the great skeptic to emerge with a new lecture on the chemistry of the final moment. But I couldn't do it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the source code. I felt the presence. I realized that if I went back to my old way of thinking, I would be committing the greatest scientific fraud in history. I would be lying to the world about the most important data point ever recorded. I decided to formulate my new worldview into 3 logical pillars. The 3 pillars of the universal bridge. These are the secrets I now live by. The proofs that even the most hardened skeptic cannot ignore once they look at the evidence without the blindfold of materialism. The first pillar is the law of conscious primacy. My experience proved that the brain does not produce consciousness any more than a television set produces the actors on the screen. The brain is a limiting filter, an evolutionary valve designed to slow down the infinite stream of the source so that we can focus on survival in a 3D environment. We are not biological machines having a spiritual dream. We are spiritual broadcasts temporarily inhabiting a biological receiver. When the receiver breaks, the broadcast doesn't stop. It simply returns to the source. This is not a belief. It is a functional description of the system's architecture. The second pillar is the mathematics of moral weight. The life review showed me that the universe is not indifferent. Every action, every thought, and every intent is recorded in a non-volatile memory called the field. Love is not just an emotion, it is a coherence constant. When we act with compassion, we are optimizing the network. When we act with hatred or arrogance, we are introducing static that slows down the entire calculation. We are all participants in a massive, collaborative soul optimization project. The judgment we fear is actually just a system audit. a moment when we are forced to see the total output of our lives from the perspective of the whole. The third pillar is the unity of the Logos. Science and spirituality are not enemies. They are two different ways of reading the same code. Science is the study of the syntax, the rules by which matter and energy interact. Spirituality is the study of the context, the meaning behind the rules. To have one without the other is to be half blind. A scientist who ignores the divine is like a man studying the ink on a page, but refusing to acknowledge that there is a story being told. I realized that my mission was to help the world move toward the great synthesis, a science that recognizes the sacred, and a spirituality that respects the logical. When I finally went public with my experience, the backlash was exactly as the intelligence had predicted. I was stripped of my honorary titles. My former friends in the skeptic community published articles claiming that the great Alistair Vance had suffered a catastrophic neurological breakdown. They called me a traitor to reason, but I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just reasoning, I was seeing. I remember my final lecture at the university. The hall was packed with students and critics, all of them waiting to hear me recant or explain away my hallucination. I stood at the podium, where I had once mocked the idea of God. I looked out at the sea of skeptical faces, and I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound, aching compassion. I saw their pinhole vision, and I knew how terrifying the void looked to them. For 30 years, I began, my voice steady and clear. I told you that the universe was a cold, accidental machine. I told you that you were alone in the dark. I was wrong. I was looking at the curtain and calling it the sun. I described the algorithm of love. I explained the neurobiology of the soul. I showed them that atheism is the ultimate intellectual shortcut, a way to avoid the overwhelming responsibility of being an eternal being in a meaningful universe. By the time I finished, the hall was silent. No one laughed. No one mocked. They could feel the weight of the data. I am a different man now. I no longer spend my time debunking. I spend my time building. I work with doctors, physicists, and theologians to map the convergence. I have traded the cold comfort of the void for the electric clarity of the light. To my fellow skeptics, I say this: do not be afraid to be wrong. Being wrong is the first step toward a greater discovery. You think your intellect is a shield against the darkness, but it is actually a wall keeping out the light. The evidence you are looking for is not in a telescope or a microscope. It is in the very awareness that allows you to look through them. The end of atheism is not the end of your mind. It is the liberation of it. It is the moment you realize that you aren't just a glitch in a dead universe, but a masterpiece in a living one. My heart failed on a Swiss sidewalk, but my soul finally took its first breath. I am Alistair Vance, and I have seen the source code, and I can tell you with absolute scientific certainty, the story is real, the architect is love, and the light never ever goes out.